Welcome back to Dreamy Haven, where the mysteries of sleep and dreams come alive through whispered tales. I remain your host, Jeff, and tonight we journey to the windswept shores of Newfoundland, Canada, where fishermen and their families have passed down stories of nocturnal visitors for generations. This is a story of how an entire community came to understand and cope with a phenomenon that science now calls sleep paralysis, but which they knew simply as the Old Hag. Before we begin this haunting yet soothing tale, please subscribe to Dreamy Haven and ring that notification bell for daily stories that will guide you into peaceful slumber. Each night, we explore the fascinating intersection between folklore, science, and the mysterious realm of sleep. Now, settle into your most comfortable position. Close your eyes and let your breathing slow and deepen as we travel to these remote fishing villages. Try to guess what ancient wisdom the islanders discovered about protecting themselves from their nighttime visitors. The sound of distant waves and creaking wood will accompany us tonight. So relax completely and let this tale of maritime mystery carry you into the deepest, most restful sleep. Off the eastern coast of Canada, where the Atlantic Ocean meets jagged cliffs and hidden coves, lies the ancient island of Newfoundland. For over 400 years, hardy souls have made their living from these frigid waters, their small communities scattered like pearls along an endless coastline. In these isolated fishing villages, where the nearest neighbor might be miles away and winter nights stretch endlessly long, people learn to live with mysteries that the outside world had forgotten. The wind here carries more than salt and seaweed. It carries stories. Stories that mothers whispered to daughters, that fathers shared with sons during long voyages at sea. One such story began in the village of Trinity Bay, where an elderly fisherman named Edmund Murphy first spoke openly about his encounters with what locals called the Old Hag. It was 1892. And Edmund had been waking in the dead of night for nearly 30 years, unable to move, unable to speak, while a dark presence sat heavily upon his chest. She comes when the fog is thickest. Edmund would tell anyone who would listen, his weathered hands gripping his teacup like an anchor. Sits right here. He'd tap his chest. Heavy as a sack of cod she is. Can't move a muscle. Can't even cry out for help. But Edmund wasn't alone in his experiences. As word spread through the tight-knit community, others began to share their own encounters. Mary Kellaway, the village baker, described waking to find a shadowy figure perched at the foot of her bed, watching her with eyes that seemed to absorb all light. Young Thomas Reed, barely 16, spoke of a weight pressing down on him so heavily he feared his ribs might crack, while whispers filled his ears in a language he couldn't understand. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across families, across generations, across the scattered fishing communities that dotted Newfoundland's coast. Always the paralysis, always the pressure on the chest, always the presence of something ancient and otherworldly. Dr. William Grenfell, a missionary physician who served the remote communities, began documenting these accounts in his journals. The phenomenon appears with such regularity and consistency, he wrote, that one cannot dismiss it as mere superstition or imagination. There is something here that demands understanding. As autumn gave way to the harsh Newfoundland winter, the encounters seemed to intensify. The long nights, the isolation, the constant sound of wind and wave against the shore, all seemed to create the perfect conditions for these mysterious visitations. Families would gather around flickering oil lamps, sharing their experiences and searching for patterns, for explanations, for some way to understand what was happening to them. As winter deepened along Newfoundland's coast, the community began to notice patterns in their nighttime encounters. The Old Hag, it seemed, preferred certain conditions. She came most often during the darkest months, when snow piled high against cottage windows and the sea turned steel gray and violent. Margaret Sullivan, a midwife who had delivered most of the children in 3 neighboring villages, kept careful notes in her leather-bound journal. The visitations increased 3-fold between November and March. She wrote by candlelight, her careful script documenting not just births and deaths, but these mysterious encounters that plagued her community. She observed that the Old Hag seemed drawn to times of stress and exhaustion. Fishermen returning from particularly difficult voyages reported encounters within days of their homecoming. New mothers, already sleep-deprived and vulnerable, found themselves frequent targets. Children who had suffered trauma or illness were especially susceptible. "It's as if she can smell our weakness," whispered Agnes Murphy, Edmund's wife, as she rocked her newest grandchild near the fire. "When we're at our lowest, when sleep eludes us, and worry keeps our minds racing, that's when she comes calling." The phenomenon wasn't limited to adults. Children as young as 8 reported encounters, though their descriptions varied slightly from those of their elders. Young ones spoke of a dark lady who would stand in their doorway, growing larger and more oppressive until she filled the entire room. They described feeling as though they were sinking through their beds, falling into darkness while unable to call for their parents. Father McKinnon, the village priest, struggled to provide comfort and explanation. "I have served in cities and in isolated parishes," he confided to Dr. Grenfell during one of the physician's visits. "But never have I encountered anything quite like this. It affects good Christian families, people of strong faith and moral character." The priest began conducting house blessings, sprinkling holy water in bedrooms, and reciting prayers of protection. Some families reported temporary relief, but for others, the old hag seemed entirely unmoved by religious intervention. It was Margaret Sullivan who first suggested that perhaps the old hag wasn't supernatural at all, but something rooted in the body itself. "I've delivered enough babies to know that the human body holds mysteries we're only beginning to understand," she said during a community gathering in the church hall. Perhaps what we're calling the old hag is something that happens to us, not something that happens to us from outside. This radical suggestion divided the community. Some clung to traditional explanations: curses, spirits, punishment for unknown sins. Others began to consider Margaret's words, wondering if their shared experience might have a more earthly explanation. Young Dr. Sarah Campbell, fresh from medical school in Halifax, arrived in Trinity Bay that spring with modern ideas and scientific curiosity. She listened intently to the stories, examined those who had experienced encounters, and began to formulate theories based on her training in the emerging field of neurology. "The consistency of the symptoms suggests a medical phenomenon," she wrote to her former professor. "The paralysis, the pressure on the chest, the terrifying hallucinations, all point to what some European physicians are beginning to call sleep paralysis." But even as science began to offer explanations, the old hag continued her visits, leaving the community caught between ancient fears and modern understanding. Dr. Sarah Campbell's arrival brought new hope to the community, but also new questions. As she interviewed family after family, documenting their experiences with scientific precision, a more complex picture of the old hag phenomenon began to emerge. The human brain, Dr. Campbell explained to a gathering in the church hall, transitions through different stages of sleep. Sometimes, this transition doesn't occur smoothly. She drew simple diagrams on a slate board, showing how consciousness could become trapped between sleeping and waking states. During this in-between state, she continued, the body remains paralyzed as it would be during deep sleep, but the mind is partially awake and aware. The brain, confused by this contradiction, may create terrifying hallucinations to explain the experience. But even Dr. Campbell's scientific explanations couldn't account for every aspect of the phenomenon. Why did so many people report similar visitations? Why did the Old Hag appear more frequently during times of stress and isolation? And why did some families seem more susceptible than others? Old Henrik Andersen, whose Norwegian ancestors had settled in Newfoundland generations earlier, shared stories from his homeland. "We called her Pinny," he said, his accent thick with the music of 2 languages. "The Norse knew of her long before your science had names for such things." Henrik's grandmother had taught him protective rituals that had been passed down through centuries. "Sleep with your feet toward the door," he advised. "Keep iron under your pillow. Never sleep on your back when the moon is dark." As spring turned to summer, Dr. Campbell began an unprecedented study. She asked volunteers from the community to keep detailed sleep journals, recording not just their encounters with the Old Hag, but their daily routines, stress levels, diet, and sleeping positions. The results were fascinating. People who slept on their backs reported encounters 3 times more frequently than those who slept on their sides. Encounters peaked during the week following the new moon, when nights were darkest. Individuals who worked physically demanding jobs seemed less susceptible than those whose work was sedentary or mentally stressful. Martha Blackwood, the village school teacher, made perhaps the most intriguing observation. "The children who report encounters," she noted, "are invariably the most imaginative, the most sensitive to their surroundings. They're often the ones who excel in storytelling, but struggle with mathematics, who can sense a change in weather hours before it arrives." This led Dr. Campbell to wonder if certain types of minds might be more susceptible to sleep paralysis. Perhaps the same neural pathways that allowed for vivid imagination and heightened sensitivity also made individuals more prone to these disturbing experiences. Meanwhile, the community began developing its own coping strategies, blending ancient wisdom with new understanding. Families started following sleep hygiene practices that Dr. Campbell recommended, maintaining regular bedtimes, avoiding heavy meals before sleep, creating calm and comfortable sleeping environments. But they also continued the protective rituals their ancestors had passed down. Iron horseshoes appeared above doorways. Small pouches of blessed salt were tucked under pillows. Children were taught to sleep with their hands folded over their hearts, forming a protective barrier against the old hag's crushing weight. Perhaps, suggested Father McKinnon during a community meeting, science and tradition need not be enemies. Perhaps they're simply different ways of understanding the same mystery. As the seasons cycled and the study continued, something remarkable happened. The frequency of encounters began to decrease, not because the old hag had gone away, but because the community had learned to understand and manage their relationship with her. Knowledge, it seemed, was its own form of protection. As Dr. Campbell's research progressed through the long Newfoundland winter, she began corresponding with physicians and researchers across the Atlantic. What she discovered was that the old hag of Newfoundland was not unique. Similar phenomena had been documented in cultures around the world for thousands of years. In Japan, they called it kanashibari, bound by metal. Italian physicians wrote of pinzimonio, the crushing sensation that accompanied the paralysis. Throughout the Caribbean, people spoke of being hag-rode, using the same terminology that had somehow found its way to Newfoundland's shores. The human experience of sleep paralysis appears to be universal, Dr. Campbell wrote in her journal. But each culture has developed its own explanations, its own protective rituals, its own ways of coping with this frightening phenomenon. Through her correspondence with Dr. Mitchell Weir in Philadelphia, one of the pioneering neurologists of the era, Campbell learned that sleep paralysis occurred when the brain's normal mechanisms for transitioning between sleep states became disrupted. During REM sleep, the body naturally became paralyzed to prevent us from acting out our dreams. But sometimes, consciousness would return while this paralysis was still in effect. The terrifying hallucinations, the sense of a malevolent presence, the feeling of being watched or touched, or the brain's attempt to make sense of an inherently confusing and frightening situation. Unable to move or speak, the partially awake mind would create explanations for its helpless state. The old hag, Dr. Campbell explained to the community, is real in the sense that the experience is absolutely genuine and terrifying. But she exists in the borderland between sleep and waking, in the mysterious realm where consciousness meets paralysis. This explanation brought comfort to some and confusion to others. How could something that felt so real, so present, so undeniably external, actually be created by their own minds? Old Henrik Anderson nodded thoughtfully when Dr. Campbell shared her findings. The Norse believed that the soul could travel while the body slept, he said. Perhaps what you call science and what we call spirits are just different words for the same mystery. As understanding grew, the community's relationship with the Old Hag began to change. Rather than passive victims of an incomprehensible force, they began to see themselves as participants in a complex neurological phenomenon that, while frightening, was also fundamentally human. Parents taught their children that if the Old Hag visited, they should remain calm and remember that she was a creation of their own sleeping mind, not an external threat. Wait patiently, they would say. Remember that this feeling will pass. The Old Hag has no power over you except what you give her. Remarkably, this shift in understanding seemed to reduce both the frequency and intensity of encounters. When people stopped fearing the Old Hag as a supernatural threat and began understanding her as a neurological phenomenon, her visits became less traumatic and, eventually, less frequent. The community had learned one of humanity's most powerful lessons, that knowledge truly was a form of protection, and understanding could transform fear into manageable experience. Years passed, and the Old Hag's visits to the fishing communities of Newfoundland became less frequent, though they never disappeared entirely. Dr. Campbell's research had been published in medical journals, contributing to the growing understanding of sleep paralysis in the scientific community. But perhaps more importantly, the people of Trinity Bay and the surrounding villages had developed something rare and valuable: a community-based approach to dealing with a frightening and mysterious phenomenon. They had learned to balance scientific understanding with traditional wisdom, creating a support system that helped individuals cope with experiences that, while explainable, remained genuinely terrifying. Families continued to pass down the protective rituals, the iron under pillows, the careful attention to sleeping positions, the emphasis on rest and stress reduction. But now these practices were understood not as defenses against supernatural forces, but as practical strategies for promoting healthy sleep and reducing the conditions that could trigger paralysis episodes. Children grew up knowing that if they ever encountered the Old Hag, they were experiencing something that was part of the human condition, something their neighbors and family members had experienced and survived. They learned that fear, while natural, need not be overwhelming, and that even the most frightening experiences could be understood and managed. Dr. Campbell eventually left Newfoundland to continue her research in larger cities, but she carried with her the lessons learned in those remote fishing villages. The people of Newfoundland taught me, she wrote in her memoirs years later, that healing comes not just from understanding the mechanism of a phenomenon, but from creating communities of support and shared knowledge. The Old Hag still visits occasionally when the nights are longest and the fog rolls thick across the Atlantic. But she no longer comes as a terrifying unknown. She comes as a reminder of the mystery that still exists in the borderlands of consciousness, and of the power of communities to face that mystery together. In the quiet fishing villages of Newfoundland, where the sea meets the sky and the wind carries stories across generations, people sleep a little more peacefully, knowing that even the darkest visitors of the night can be understood, managed, and ultimately transcended through knowledge, community, and courage. And so we reach the end of our journey to the windswept shores of Newfoundland, where an entire community learned to transform fear into understanding. The Old Hag continues to visit sleepers around the world, but perhaps now you understand that this ancient visitor is not a supernatural threat, but a fascinating glimpse into the mysterious workings of the human mind during sleep. As you drift toward your own peaceful slumber tonight, remember the wisdom of the Newfoundland fishing communities. That knowledge is protection. That community support can transform fear, and that even our most frightening experiences can become opportunities for understanding and growth. If you've enjoyed this tale of maritime mystery and scientific discovery, please subscribe to Dreamy Haven for more stories that explore the fascinating borderlands between sleep and waking, between science and folklore, between fear and understanding. Sweet dreams, dear listeners. May your sleep be deep and peaceful, and may any visitors to your dreams be gentle ones. Until tomorrow night, this is Dreamy Haven, wishing you the most restful slumber.